Bentornati tutti dopo l'intervallo, quindi riprendiamo.
Welcome back. We are going to resume our reflection and our dialogue after the break. But before we start with the next talks and before I'm going to introduce the next speakers, I would like to remind you the basic rules we should follow for the success of our event. I would like to ask the different speakers not to speak too fast, which is very important for simultaneous interpreting, and please stick to our schedule and to the allotted speech time, that is to say 15 minutes. I know it's difficult because I'm going to speak myself, so I'm telling this myself too. So after 10 minutes, I'll be raising my hands here on this Zoom platform so that this will be a sign to let you know that you only have 5 minutes left. And then towards the end of your speech, I'll be raising once again my hand to tell you that your speaking time is over. These are important rules we should all follow. And now I have the pleasure to introduce the first pair of this session, which is about Saint Augustine, inner look and word. This topic is going to be presented by Professor Gaetano Piccolo, who's professor and dean of the Faculty of Philosophy of the Pontifical Gregorian University, and he is a respondent, Emanuele Scarpino, who is a third cycle student at the Faculty of Philosophy of the Gregorian University. I'll give you the floor, Professor Piccolo. Good evening, everybody, and congratulations on the wonderful organizational work together with Emanuele. We're going to present our reflections about Saint Augustine of Hippo that can be read as a further analysis of the topic of the inner look. So we are going to suggest an exercise of the reading of the thought of Saint Agostino. We'll be focusing on two stages. The initial stage I'll be highlighting, and then Emanuele will be talking about the result of this journey. So I'll be talking about the end of the intellectual journey of Augustine. As far as I am concerned, I'm going to analyze the initial part of the development of Augustine's thought, and I'm going to dwell on youth dialogue, where the topic of the gaze can be found, which is connected with the topic of the word in the De Magistro. And then in our analysis, we'll try and see how this topic of the inner look is closely connected with the issue of words. The De Magistro is a dialogue that can be placed towards the 388 to 390, and is a dialogue that Augustine wrote in his youth after he left Casisciacum, a place next to Milan. It's hard to identify where he moved with his family and friends to create a sort of pedagogical path for his family and friends. And after these experience where Deodatus also was involved, Augustine moved back to Africa, where he wrote this dialogue that probably makes reference to a dialogue that actually took place with his son Deodatus, and he wrote it down to honor the memory of his son who died prematurely. To interpret a work by Augustine, the most important thing, the initial step we need to take is to see what Augustine said in the Retractationes, that is to say, the interpretation Augustine himself gave of that work. In the The Magistro Augustine says that the purpose of this dialogue is to show that the only teacher is Christ, as it is written in chapter 23 of the Gospel of Matthew. To this end, it is in order to show that Christ is the only teacher. In this dialogue, Augustine analyzes how human teaching takes place and how words work. So he devotes a large part of this work to analyze words, and because human masters to teach use human words, but showing that human words in reality do not teach anything, as we're going to see why, the only source of learning needs to be found somewhere else. That is to say, in the interiority where Christ teaches the master that he's teaching inside. It's important to make it clear that in the Magistro, Augustine uses the adverb intus. That is to say, Christ is the teacher who teaches within. So we do not find the expression inner teacher that Augustine will be using later later in the treatise on the Gospel of John. So when we um, deal with these topics in the Magistro, it's easy to immediately compare it to the Menon by Plato. And it's interesting to note that the Magist is the exact opposite of the Menon. So the focus in the Magistro is placed on the disciple. Augustine, as a matter of fact, wants to highlight the autonomy of the disciple in the learning process. As we're going to see in a while, the idea of Augustine of learning is that the disciple is able to find the truth within him or herself. And in the pursuit of truth is supported by Christ, the inner master. And in interiority, we find the first reference to gaze or look. Well, in the interiority, we can see everything. So we see the expression totum conspicere that we find in chapter 12 of the De Magistro. So in the interiority, it's possible to recognize the truth because only in the interiority we can see the whole. And that's quite the opposite uh, in Plato's Menon, well, because there Plato focuses on the ability of the teacher, that is Socrates, that with well-orchestrated questions can help the slave of Menon the truth that already lies within himself. In the Magistra, on the other hand, Augustine highlights the autonomy in learning of the disciple. In chapter 14 of the De Magister, we read, those who are called disciples consider within themselves whether things have been spoken that are true. That is to say, observing that inner truth as well as they can. So we should wonder, how come can words cannot words teach anything, and why is the look so important to this initial stage of Augustine's thought? So let's try and think of the structure of the Demagogy. So the first 9 chapters out of 14 are devoted to an analysis of the signs, and among them words. Chapter 10, in the very center of the De Magistro, has an enigmatic, problematic expression that is following these analysis of the signs. Augustine says, perea signa qua verba appellantur nos nihil decision. That is to say, through those signs that are called words, we cannot learn anything. This leads to the last part of the De Magistro, from chapter 11 to chapter 14, where we can find the so-called doctrine of inner illumination, or inner enlightenment by Augustine. So the enigma are placed before in the De Magistro is therefore this: why can't we learn anything through words? Why don't they teach anything? And Augustine again simplifies this with an example. For example, the word sarabara. It's not the word by itself that will make us understand what its meaning or its content is. If you already know the meaning of that word, it's not the word that has made the meaning known to us. So if we already know the meaning of the word, it's not the word that has made it known to us. So words do not teach us anything. That's Augustine's conclusion. And here's another reference to the gaze. It is the things themselves that teach us, not the words. And we can also understand where many considerations originated from. In chapter 10, Augustine says, when I learned the thing itself, I didn't believe the words of another, but my own eyes. Yet, in a certain sense, I believed the words in order to turn my attention, that is, so that I might seek with my eyes ut aspecto quererem towards what I had to see. Words therefore have two functions: an evocative function, that is to say, they allow us to recall the object we already know, or a signaling function, that is, they allow us to indicate where to look, where we can attendere, where we can turn our look in order to find the object that will allow me to learn. So this first initial stage of Augustine's thought, we can say that there's a model of knowledge by image. The disciple that is listening, as we said at the beginning, has the task of considering within himself or herself whether what's being said is true, and they can either give or withhold their consent. So they put all their pieces together, they see the whole, and supported by Christ, a light that is teaching from within can give their consent and they can say whether uh, what is true has been said or not. Another question we have is why are words limited? Why they do not teach us anything? In order to understand that, we have to know that at this stage of its thought, that Augustine is still influenced by the historic doctrine related to science and words, as we're going to see also in Emanuele's speech. It will be the encounter and the reflection on the topics of Neoplatonism that will allow Augustine to change his idea of word, of verbum, and of interiority and look. But in this stage, at this stage, Augustine thinks about the verbum in the way of the lexis word of the Stoics, but for the Stoics, lexis is material, and therefore Augustine says if the verbum as a word is material, it cannot enter our interiority. So what do we owe the impression that human masters are teaching us? Augustine says that teachers are not teaching us anything. They just tell us where to look, or they give us pieces that we have to put together. It's only the short period of time between the master's words and the disciples' understanding that leads one to think that the words are the cause of the learning. But in reality, having heard the words, the disciple has searched within himself or herself. And that's the reason why, during this first stage of his thought, uh, the loop is closely connected with the limits or the functions of words that are prompting us to look within ourselves, where we can put all pieces together, supported by Christ, that is the light who teaches within. We can give consensus to a proposition. And this is another element of a Stoic thought, which once again confirms that the philosophical backdrop that Augustine has in his mind is a Stoic one and not the Neoplatonic one. And now in Emanuele's speech, we'll see how the concept of verbs will change in the light of Neoplatonism and how this is reflected in the matter of interiority and of the look.
Grazie. Adesso la parola a Emanuele Scarpino.
Thanks. Now
I'll give the floor
going
to Emanuele Scarpino.
to Emanuele Scarpino.
Buonasera.
Good evening.
In primo luogo mi sia permesso
First of
esprimere un vivo
Allow
ringraziamento a chi
me
ha
to
organizzato
express my
questo forum
heartfelt
con delle
thanks to
fattezze del
those who have
tutto originali,
organized
che
this
permettono un
forum,
particolare
which is
incrocio di
rather
sguardi da parte di
original.
esperti e
This
studenti
meeting
su
just
temi che sono capaci di
enables
rinnovare il
experts and
nostro entusiasmo nella
students to
ricerca.
discuss
La
topics
relazione
that
del
can
professore Piccolo
renew
ha
our
permesso di cogliere qual è il
enthusiasm
primo
for
tratto di
research.
cammino che
The
Agostino
report
di
by
Ippona
Professor
conduce
Pico
in ordine allo
made it
sviluppo
possible
della
to
sua
grasp
concezione
what
del
is the
verbum.
first stretch
Il
of the
professore ha
path that
attribuito al primo stadio della
Augustine
ricerca
made
dell'Ipponate
in
sul
the
verbum
development of
alcune
this
interessanti
concept of the
caratteristiche
verbum.
che
And the
potremmo definire
Professor
in questo
Piccolo
modo. La
just
concezione
stressed some
primordiale
important
potrebbe essere definita a
characteristics
tratti
that
come
is the primordial
imbarazzante e
conception
fuorviante sotto
that
l'aspetto
sometimes
teologico
could
a
be
causa della
described
prospettiva
as
materialista
embarrassing and
da cui si
misleading
muove.
from a
Queste
theological
sensazioni, che
point of
potrebbero
view
essere
because
state
of the
avvertite dallo stesso
materialistic
Agostino,
perspective
vista la
of
sua
ancient
reticenza
roots.
nell'utilizzare il
These
concetto di
sensations,
verbo
which
per
might have
parlare
been
della
felt
seconda
by
persona della
Augustine
Trinità,
himself, given
nonostante
his
l'imponente
reticence
sostegno
in
della
using the
testimonianza
primordial
normativa
conception
della
as a
scrittura,
theological
credo
perspective,
possano
are
trovare il
not
loro orizzonte di
necessarily
comprensione nella
just
continua educazione
understandable.
dello sguardo di
Those
Agostino.
we must
Come affermano
consider
diversi
the
studiosi, infatti, il
education
cammino che
to
Agostino
gaze
compie
in
nell'orizzonte di fede è anche
Augustine.
un cammino
So
che
there is a
richiede una
path, a
lenta
great
assunzione di
path in
responsabilità nell'ambito
Augustine, and
ecclesiale.
during this
La
path
crescita
he takes
identitaria del
on
cristiano
responsibility,
Agostino
and
influisce
he also
inevitabilmente sul suo
grows
percorso
as a
di ricerca,
Christian, and
tanto da
his
essere condotto a
personal path
rileggere le
just
coordinate
has
di
an
indagine
impact
secondo
also on
spessori
his
sempre più
thought
importanti.
and ideas.
Forse è proprio questa
Maybe
educazione
it
dello
is
sguardo che ha
this
condotto
gaze
Agostino ad attivare una
education that
sorta di
led
circolo ermeneutico
Augustine
tra
to
l'analisi di
find
temi
a sort
teologici
of
ed alcune
an
questioni di
hermeneutical
filosofia,
circle,
come
and
abbiamo già
also
visto nello
considering
specifico di
some
filosofia del
philosophical
linguaggio.
issues,
La
as
cui adesso
we saw
attingiamo
in
per
the
avere
philosophy
testimonianza
of
di questo avanzamento
language.
concettuale in
So
Agostino
there
è
is a
il De
witness of
Trinitate. Si
this
tratta di questo trattato.
path, and the
problema tecnico. I relatori devono scegliere il canale italiano
so
disattivato per i traduttori, quindi non so se
E attualmente è disattivato. Metto italiano?
c'è il problema segnato dal host. Quindi, sì, va bene, lo trasmetto. Grazie, spero di continuare.
So we find all this in the
Dicevo che la
Trinitate.
fonte cui attingiamo
So
per
this
avere
is the
testimonianza di
source
questo
we have
avanzamento
in order to
concettuale è
find
appunto il De
this
Trinitate. Si tratta
progress
di questo
in
trattato che il
Augustine. This is
filosofo
a
offre per
treatise
concentrare la
that
sua
is offered
attenzione
to
sulla più
focus his
importante verità
attention on
cristiana
the most
rivelata.
important
Nella
Christian
seconda
truth.
parte di
In the
questo
second
contributo, nello
part of this
specifico mi riferisco ai
contribution,
libri che vanno
I
dal
would
nono al
like to
quindicesimo,
speak about
Agostino
books
propone
9 and
all'attenzione del
15,
lettore
where
diverse
Augustine
triadi.
offers
Come
some
sottolineato,
triads.
Agostino non offre
Has
una
said,
sistematica delle
Augustine
immagini
does
trinitarie che
not
si offrono
offer a
nell'esperienza umana,
systematization
ma
of
è
the
come se attraverso il
Trinitarian
trattato egli
images,
si facesse
but through
interprete di
this
un esercizio
treatise
che la
he
sua anima
becomes the
realizza e che
interpreter
le
of an
permette di cogliersi
exercise
come
that his
realtà
soul
creata ad
carries out,
immagine di Dio.
and that
Per
just
questo non ci
makes
troviamo di
him
fronte
speak
ad un
about
approccio
the image
analitico,
of
ma
God.
leggiamo un
So this is
proliferare di
not an
immagini. Egli
analytical
quindi
approach,
intende
but this is a
indagare quell'immagine di
proliferation
Dio che lo
of
stesso
images,
creatore ha
and he
impresso
tries
nell'anima
to
dell'uomo.
investigate the
Nel libro
image of
nono,
God that
Agostino
the
afferma che nella
Creator
mente dell'uomo
himself
è
has
possibile trovare una
imprinted
certa
in his
Trinità.
soul.
La
So in book
mente,
9,
mens,
he
la
speaks about
conoscenza,
the
notizia
Trinity,
e
that is
l'amore,
the
amor.
mind,
Queste
mens,
cose, annota
knowledge,
Agostino, sono
notizia,
uguali
and
fra
love,
loro e di
amor.
un'unica
These
essenza.
things are
In
equal
questa
to one
sezione,
another and
guardando
of
in
one
modo
same
specifico alla mente
essence.
dell'uomo, Agostino
So if
osserva che
we
essa può
consider
essere
man's mind,
coinvolta in un moto d'amore
Augustine says
indirizzato
that
esclusivamente a se
mind
stesso.
can Ciò porterebbe ad affermare che in questo rapporto sono da ricercare solo due elementi, la mente e l'amore che essa prova nei riguardi di sé. Procedendo nella riflessione, però Agostino annota che si è in presenza comunque di un'immagine trinitaria, in quanto in questo rapporto è da inserire necessariamente anche la conoscenza. Infatti non è possibile amare ciò che non si conosce del tutto. La conoscenza in questa dinamica ancora solipsista si presenta come una realtà con un'antecedenza logica rispetto all'amore. Ecco perché Agostino nel XV libro, riassumendo un po' il suo percorso, propone l'ordine mente, conoscenza e amore. Dice Catapano, stabilita l'esistenza e quindi l'ordine di questi tre termini, Agostino cerca di mettere in evidenza le loro analogie con la Trinità divina. Nel libro nono, Agostino riprende il tema della conoscenza interiore e la pone in relazione con il Verbo divino. Agostino vuole sottolineare una potente analogia che a suo parere sussiste tra la conoscenza e il Verbo e che potrebbe rendere ragione della dinamica particolare che sussiste in Dio, che concilia in sé la differenza delle persone con una continua unità operativa. Agostino sceglie di porre sotto la lente della sua ricerca il movimento dell'incarnazione. Per trattare di ciò, Agostino propone un'importante novità riguardo al concetto di verbum. Se, come abbiamo ascoltato nella relazione del professore Piccolo, nel De Magistro Agostino afferma che non è possibile imparare alcunché mediante l'ascolto di parole, nel trattato sulla Trinità si assiste invece all'assunzione di una posizione centrale da parte del Verbo. In alcuni suoi interventi il professore Piccolo ha messo in luce il particolare passaggio che si realizza nello sviluppo del pensiero di Agostino, il quale sceglie di mettere da parte la visione stoica della parola, evidentemente inopportuna per trattare di elementi riguardanti la Trinità, per approdare ad una innovativa concezione del Verbo, che trova possibilità di realizzazione grazie all'assunzione di alcune coordinate platoniche. Per seguire lo sviluppo del pensiero agostiniano è necessario assumere alcune categorie che vengono spiegate dallo stesso autore. Nello specifico mi riferisco alla differenza tra nosse e cogitare. La prima coordinata indica un livello di conoscenza stabile. In essa rientrano quelle conoscenze che non sono catturate attualmente dal pensiero, ma che possono essere definite proprie del soggetto e che, sebbene esse siano sempre nella condizione di essere rese per mezzo delle parole, si presentano sotto un aspetto previo a quello della formazione concettuale. È in questa sorta di grembo che può essere generato il verbo interiore, quella parola cioè non condizionata ancora da legami dettati dalle strutture delle diverse lingue. L'altra coordinata è quella del cogitare. Essa si riferisce a quelle conoscenze che sono coinvolte nel lavorio del cogito e che quindi sono verbalizzate. Il cogito lavora a partire da ciò che è conosciuto, che dunque rientra nella categoria del nos, ma produce un dinamismo del tutto particolare. Per spiegare il movimento prodotto dal cogito, Agostino ricorre proprio alla metafora dello sguardo. Egli afferma che il pensiero, la cogitatio, è una certa visione dell'anima. Come afferma Catapano, il pensiero è concepito da Agostino come una specie di visione e quindi descritto secondo il modello della visione fisica, che a sua volta viene spiegata come una ricezione per impressione della forma dell'oggetto visto. Si tratta di un particolare dinamismo che Gilson descrive con queste parole. La cogitazio agostiniana altro non è che il movimento con cui la nostra anima unifica, raduna e raccoglie per poter fissare su di esse lo sguardo tutte le conoscenze latenti che possiede senza averle ancora distinte. Agostino riporta nel XIV libro un qualcosa che manifesta l'influenza del platonismo su questo movimento della cogitazio, che sembra racchiudere in sé differenti sfaccettature. Infatti, nel momento in cui il dinamismo del cogito si dirige verso gli elementi che erano presenti nel soggetto in maniera latente
touched by
apprende.
thought,
Quando il
we can say
pensiero si
that the
dirige invece
subject
verso quegli
can
elementi
be
che,
learned,
essendo stati
and when
coinvolti
the
in un
thought
tempo
is
precedente nel
directed
movimento del
towards
cogito,
those
sono stati poi
elements
dimenticati,
which
il
had
movimento che
been
si viene a
forgotten,
creare
the
è quello
movement
del
that is
ricordo.
created is
Questa
the
conoscenza,
movement
frutto del
of
lavoro del pensiero,
remembering.
si realizza
So
attraverso
this
un
is,
processo che
let's say,
permette
the
di
result of the
raggiungere
work
oppure
of our
recuperare
thought,
una
and it
conoscenza
is
e di
attained
portarla a
by
verbalizzazione
bringing to a
attraverso una
sort of
lingua. Così si ha un
verbalization
verbo
through language.
esterno che
So
trova
we
una
have an
concretezza
external
espressiva
verb
attraverso la
that finds
voce.
an expression
Tale processo
through the
però può riguardare
voice.
solo
This
l'uomo,
process
in
can
quanto è
only
determinato da uno
concern
sviluppo.
man, as it is
Se questo
determined
processo
by
fosse
development.
proiettato
If
nella
this
sostanza
process were
divina,
projected
genererebbe
into
delle
the divine
contraddizioni, in
substance,
quanto
there
inserirebbe
would
in Dio
be
un cammino di
contradictions,
perfezionamento.
because there
Per altri
would
versi,
be a
poi, il
path
processo
to
di
perfection
cogitazio
in
potrebbe anche essere
God.
definito
So the
escludente,
process of
perché nel momento in
cogitatio
cui il
could
lavoro
also
del
be
pensiero coinvolge
considered
un
as
oggetto,
a
l'attenzione
sort
viene
of
eliminata da altro.
exclusion,
E questa
because
prospettiva è
at the
chiaramente
moment when the work
divergente
of
rispetto
thought
alla
involves
sostanza
an
divina
object,
che considera
attention
tutto
is
nell'eternità.
removed from something else.
Sebbene quindi per
On the
questi
contrary,
motivi
God
non sia
contains
possibile
everything. So if it
adottare
is
queste
not
due
possible
coordinate
to
per
adopt these two coordinates to speak about God, Augustine holds back the dynamic which is established between the two coordinates. This is a sort of a bridge. In fact, as far as we have said about the two coordinates, that is nos and cogitatio, it is possible to say that thinkability is closely linked to knowledge, even before the contents of knowledge are involved in the movement of thought. So they are thinkable. And here there is a perspective of communion between linguistic and theological themes. For Augustine, in fact, the answer to the question, what is the origin of words, is not something to be verbalized. In the De Trinitate, Augustine states that word is generated by a vision of thought, by an internal gaze. The relationship between thinking and speaking can be explained by the relationship between an inner word and an outer word. We can say that the internal word is the logical horizon of the external word, and the relationship between these two verbal forms is placed by Augustine on the same place as the relationship between the divine word and the humanized word. Paulus states that even our inner word, before being embodied in an external word, can be justified from the science, by the science from which it originates. So there is a similarity between the inner word and the eternal divine word. So there is no external word without an internal word. On the contrary, there can be an internal word even though there is not an external one. So this is something that is in tune with the divine ontological statute, whose existence is not subordinated to the manifestation of revelation. The word does not come into existence in the process of incarnation. The inner word is true. It exists in itself. In fact, the internal word assumes the same form as what has been known. The external word, on the other hand, cannot guarantee the same level of identification because it is subject to the sensitive mediation of communication. Finally, the inner word enjoys the possibility of being rendered by means of the outer word, but this sensitive translation does not generate modifications in the inner word. Rather, it is the assumption of an instrumental dimension that makes the inner world communicable. This characteristic of the interior world enables Augustine to observe the particular dynamic in the light of the mystery of the incarnation of the Word, which leads to a greater understanding of the human dynamics of communication. The Son, in fact, took on the flesh as a kind of sort of vehicle to reach humanity without distancing himself from the Father. In this respect, it is possible to find a correspondence between notitia and verbum, which both refer to the logos. So the verbum is to be understood as the possibility of expressing the notitia. And here, the possibility of expression is implicit in knowledge. So there is a relationship of generation that starts from the notitia and arrives at the verbum. So this brief overview of the development of the concept of the verbum succeeds in bringing us face to face with the complexities of Augustine's vision. So he wanted to know the Creator, even influenced by his ecclesial responsibility, which led him to assume more and more the posture of a teacher in the faith. So he decided to broaden his vision, and he wanted to remodulate the coordinates. And Augustine is not a slave to the Stoical convictions that had led him to assume a materialistic vision and had forced him to renounce the use of the concept of the verb in order to speak of the second person of the Trinity. He, on the contrary, tried to adopt new categories, that is the Platonic categories, but with a different critical eye. Augustine, in fact, was able of bringing novelties, and he wanted to find a new foundations on the truth of creation. So we can say that this education of the gaze in Augustine is rather something that generates enthusiasm. He's not just trapped in some philosophical thinking, but his gaze is a living gaze capable of assuming the right distance so that the shining truth does not blind out, but on the contrary encourages our understanding of the mystery of God. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your meditation and your gaze on Augustine. Now, I would like to introduce the next couple of reporters, and I really would like to encourage all speakers to just click on the Italian channel. Yeah, so you must be on the Italian channel so that there is no overlapping with the translation. Well, now we have a different theme, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, to see all things new in the world. So now we give the floor to Nicholas Steves, professor at the Gregorian University and moderator of the first cycle of theology, and the respondent is Lisa Lucchese, that is a student in the third theological cycle at the Gregorian University. Now the floor is yours. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Zudona for her friendly and keen invitation to this conference. I also want to thank Mrs. Lisa Lucchese for agreeing to be my respondent. So we both work in fundamental theology, a field that is per se transdisciplinary, and it is at the crossroads between theology and philosophy, art, psychology, history, and so forth. So we are going to speak half an hour. about the following theme, that is Saint Ignatius of Loyola, to see all things new in the world. And this is because Yvonne initially proposed a slightly different title, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, to see all the new things in the world. So the adjective was applied to things rather than to seeing or to the gaze. So maybe we might go back to this question in the Q&A session, but now I would like to offer 3 points: an explicatio terminorum, focus on Ignatius' visual experiences, and then third point, what Ignatius taught us. So first step, explicatio terminorum, on the 2 terms in the heading, that is Ignatius of Loyola and seeing. Who is Ignatius of Loyola? Maybe not all of you are Jesuits, Ignatians, or even Christians. So very briefly, he was born in 1491 and died in 1556. And he was born in Spain, and after powerful experiences, internal and external experiences, at the age of 30, 500 years ago exactly, he gave up his career as a soldier and as a courtier to embrace an ascetic, mystical, and practical life in search of God. And after years of introspections, of contemplative and liturgical prayer, of theological studies in Spain, in the Holy Land and Paris, he went to Rome to meet the Pope with a group of friends united by religious vows and by priesthood. This group grew and became, with the support of the Pope, the Society of Jesus, and the members of this society are known as Jesuits. Many religious sisters, laymen, and lay women follow Saint Ignatius' prayer method, summarized in a book called Spiritual Exercises, and this heading in full is the following, that is spiritual exercises to conquer oneself and put order in one's life without making decisions based on any disordered attachment. So we also have many letters by Ignatius. We have an autobiography dictated a few years before his death and some fragments of his spiritual diary. These texts, which are the foundation of Ignatian spirituality, were supplemented by other texts written by Ignatius in order to explain the strength of his vision. So from this very brief sketch, maybe you have understood that the visions and seeing are at very heart of Ignatius' life and thought. It is also clear that this school of gaze spread also spread among Catholics, but even beyond. And what does this school of seeing or of sight is about? So in order to speak about Thomas Kuhn, Christ's disciples share a certain imaginative paradigm. There is a worldview nourished by gospel narratives, as well as by other biblical writings, and also by certain elements transmitted from generation to generation, just referred to as a Christian tradition. So scriptures and tradition just represents for Christians divine revelation, and it is regulated by the ecclesial magisterium, that is by the documents issued by the Pope and bishops. Now, you know that a certain Martin Luther just proposed in Germany a certain interpretation of the scriptures. So Saint Ignatius of Loyola, on the contrary, offered a different Christian paradigm, and this paradigm just amplified a richness of worldviews born from the richness of divine revelation itself. That is, the four Gospels about Christ's life, and this richness was increased over the centuries by the visions and worldviews of mystic saints, founders such as Benedict, Bernard, Dominic, Francis, and Clare. All these different visions, Catholic visions with different aspects, had both an inner and outer aspect. And now I would like to speak about these two elements with respect to Ignatius' imagination. So now on second point, Ignatius, a new imaginative worldview. So what is this worldview about? In his autobiography, we can see that he had a certain aesthetic taste, that is beautiful handwriting. He just compiled a book with the words of Jesus in red and those of Mary in blue. Ignatius always considered people and things with the bodily eyes, but after his conversion, he discovered his inner spiritual side. And what was it? In short, the Christian tradition, as others, claims that we are endowed both with bodily and spiritual senses. We see, we hear, we touch, we taste and smell with our bodily organs. We are likewise and logically able to see, to hear, to touch, to taste and smell with our inner senses. And just as our bodily senses give us true perception and knowledge of sensible reality to think and act, so our spiritual senses give us a knowledge of sensible realities, God, the soul, freedom, and so on. Let's go back to Ignatius. So he had various visionary experiences. For instance, when he convalesced one night while he was still awake, he clearly saw an image of Our Lady with the Holy Child, Jesus, and this image caused him a very great consolation. Now this vision had an ethical effect. He felt such a disgust for the whole past life, especially for carnal things, that it seemed to him that all the imaginations that had previously been so deeply rooted in him and vivid had now disappeared from his soul, and now he gave up even the smallest sensual solicitations. Here we find a paradigm of how this religious vision led Ignatius to see things anew. That is, his body, his sensuality were seen with new eyes. In order to quote the title of his spiritual exercises, he just put his life in order so that he no longer made decisions on the basis of disordered attachments. So the womanizes, and the person he had been before suddenly became chaste and respectful. And so he had also other visions. Some of these visions came from the devil, but most visions came from God. And Ignatius discerned some ethical changes in himself on the basis of these visions, and Ignatius understood that these were changes of his own way of imagining himself, God, and others. Third step, a new imaginative vision offered to others. So let's go a step backward. Now I'm speaking about Christians in general. The Gospels themselves contain many stories of blind men being healed. In addition to their literal and historical significance, they have always had a spiritual meaning for Christians, since these are symbols of a religious conversion, of getting to see things in a new way. Another Gospel passage underlines the gaze with respect to a final horizon, the eschatological horizon. Chapter 25 in the Gospel according to Matthew, Christ just returns to judge all of humanity according to how each person has seen the poorest and most fragile. So those who saw them as Christ's representatives are helped and saved. And this means that we must see the world as Jesus saw it. So the conversion of the gaze is taught in the liturgy with the preaching, gestures, for instance, the breaking of the bread, washing of feet, baptism with water, anointing with oil. If we go back to Ignatius, he taught others to change their worldview through his writings. So he founded a sort of school with exercises, autobiography, diary, letters, and also the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. In particular, the exercises teach us to contemplate gospel scenes with a new spiritual perspective that affects how we live in our reality. And so it is by contemplating Jesus, poor and humble in the midst of others, with an inner vision that pays attention to his words and deeds, I can yearn to become like him, to see and act as he did. Conclusion. Often non-Catholics think that all of us Catholics have a single, fixed, rigid, univocal worldview. In reality, there is a certain unidiversity in the Catholic Church. Christians have always received the four Gospels with a unity of perspective that does not give rise to a uniformity of vision or imagination. Proof is the diversity of Christian art and Christian spiritualities. Ignatius offered a unique way of imagining the world, of seeing as new all things in the world. It is a very modern approach where the individual in relation to God takes the first place. But one must ask, however, whether this does not lead to an individualistic faith focused on God and me. How can we account for the effective and relational dimension within the church with a new converted worldview that is not solipsistic? And leave this to Mrs. Lucchese, whom I thank again for her response. Good evening. I also would like to thank you all for inviting me. I would like to thank Mrs. Yvonne and Professor Steve. I'll try to speak rather slowly, also because the connection that I have is not a good one. So please make me a sign if ever there is any problem. So the question is the following, that is, if this spirituality is not a sort of individualism. In the text of Ignatian spirituality, such as autobiography, spiritual exercises, and diary, we can see that there is not a perspective that now is returning to the attention of theological reflection today, that is human bonds. This theme is also the subject of my doctoral research. That is why now I would like to offer you some meditations that integrate an affective and relational aspect, which seems to me a way of seeing all things new in the world. And this is also referred to the contribution of Father Marcello Semeraro, published in a recent issue of Ignatiana, entitled Seeing All Things New in Christ. And now I would like to offer you three different prospects, triple gaze. The first on God has already effectively present in the world. The second on things in the world has places for an effective mediation to encounter God. And the third on this subject has effective actions in the world. So number one, gaze on God. To see is an activity activated by the desire to find what we are looking for. Theologically, however, we know that this is a dynamic, that is a response, because everything is born in God, based on the desire to be sought and found by us. So it is in this desire, God's desire, that we find a root of our seeking God, who wishes to be found. So human research for the things of the world is a search for God himself. So this point underlines an essential element, that is, God is already there. God is already there when we set out on our quest, and he is already there when we just are in touch with the things of the world. So this image of God is a deeply incarnated image of God. So God is mixed up with the things of the world, and he is interested, affectively interested in the world and in the things of the world. Number two, looking at things. The expression seeing all things new, and we saw that in this title of the Ignatian review, that is, this expression ends with in Christ, to see all things new in Christ, but also in the world, because this means that the world has a specifically theological meaning. In his autobiography, numbers 29 and 30, Ignatian tells that during a moment of prayer, he strongly experienced God's presence and received visions that transformed his gaze. So, starting from that moment, all things appeared new to him. But what is interesting is the conclusion to this passage, quote, all these experiences confirmed in them that in faith he could find firmness, and that also without scriptures to teach us this truth, he would have been ready to die to testify for them, even only by virtue of what he had seen. This quote is a radical one, but also raises problems. The only criterion for the truth of this experience is the personal perception of the experience itself. So there is an evident risk in that if mediations are bypassed, faith becomes a purely subjective experience, or maybe an arbitrarily a subjective experience. So the question to be solved is the question of mediations. Visions, the visions Ignatius had are rather immediate experiences, not mediated. But is it really possible to have a faith without mediation? Is it possible to transform this gaze without the objects that activate this gaze? So the things of the world just respond to this necessity of our faith journey, which is also a journey of renewal, as Ignatius said in his witness. Before his visions, he encountered other forms of mediation, such as books on the life of Christ and the saints, people he had met along the way who were more or less well versed in spiritual matters, and finally partaking in the sacraments. These are all examples of mediation coming from the world, objects, persons, rituals, and they mediated for him, for Ignatius, this encounter with Christ. So they are affective forms of mediation because they are also based on relational dynamics, and they also represent a response to the good or evil that he had encountered. So the world is a place inhabited by affective presence of God that spurs us to accept this encounter. Number 3, looking at the subject. Now we have to consider a question, an issue. Revelation is not something clear and distinct. And because of these worldly mediations, there are many gray zones. And how can a person discern? And here again, Father Semeraro's reflection might be useful. Those who want to seek God and discover new things in the world must set out on a spiritual journey that trains one to convert one's gaze. This journey, which is what Ignatius outlines in his spiritual exercise, culminates in the contemplatio ad amorem, the contemplation in order to obtain love. The spiritual exercise 230 to 37. Here, love is understood as a bond between a subject, a person, and God. And so there is something that is missing, that is the human interpersonal bond. But we can also state that it is precisely this gray zone in Revelation that offer a context which might lead a person make a sort of bond forward to meet love. In other words, seeing is doomed when it does not find what it seeks. And here there is a fundamental dynamic between revelation and man. We cannot claim we can control revelation, therefore we cannot say with certainty where it is or where it is not. So we cannot say that completely, at least. We can find these also in Gaudete and Exultate, numbers 41, 42. So here there is a new window that is opened, that is the window of love. The person is now convinced that he's going to find a relation, a threefold relation with God, things, and himself. This affective involvement is both an abandonment and a decision for in order to establish a relation. So the subject who is able to see all things new is the person that has let himself being questioned by the presence of things in the world. Is a person that has let himself be involved and has also responded in an effective way. Conclusion: in order to see all things new, we must renew our gaze. This renewal is a true and proper conversion, is a metanoia which unfolds in an affective way. So it is not a question to find new things, but we must learn how to love these things. It's a sight that is new. So to establish an affective relationship with God within the things of the world, to seek, to find, to know, these are all verbs expressing a relational dynamic that is not neutral, but that has an affective connotation. We can understand this path, this threefold gaze, and also this threefold affective conversion to God, things, and oneself is also referred to the triple conversion by Lonegan. So there is an affective conversion of the intellect, which becomes capable of knowing new things in a new way. Then there is the moral conversion, because we are able to be oriented towards love. And then there is also a religious conversion, and there we are able to respect all forms of the divine revelation. Thanks. And I and Father Steves really would like to thank you, and we are really ready to answer your questions. I really would like to thank you for your reflections that are, like, let's say, a sort of stimulation for us. And really would like to thank you for your academic speeches. And now we have a discussion. As I said, those who want to ask questions, obviously you have to raise your hand. There is a small hand that you can use, and so this hand is going to be shown up here on Zoom on the screen. And I also would like to remind you that at the end of this first moment, Di Domenico also wanted to ask a question. I don't know if he wants to ask this question now, or maybe later on. So, Di Domenico, if you want, if you want to ask your question, so maybe there is not an answer because the speakers are no longer there. So anyway, I'm asking my question nonetheless. So it is a sort of remark and question at the same time. I would like to refer to Father Ranget's speech, and also the speech by Veronica Katz, who spoke yesterday evening. She was this psychotherapist. So I could see a connection between the gaze, or maybe seeing oneself, and how we can see our image reflected in others. In fact, Mrs. Veronica just spoke about these double gaze between a mother and a child, which is essential for the child's growth. And the child is always looking for the mother's gaze, but at the same time that this dynamic is the same as the dynamic when we try to find God's gaze. And what happens when man does not find God's gaze? So what happens if this quest is not met? I really don't know if there is someone who wants to give an answer. So Father Ranjit. is not there, but maybe other speakers from the Pontifical Gregorian University might give an answer to the question. Father Steves, maybe you are together, same department, so maybe you can, so just shortly, I remember when I was a novice, the master of the novitiate, who was an old good man, told us, so obviously it was the year 2000, after 50 years of religious life, he still was afraid of the verse of the psalm saying, your gaze is always following me. And so the master said that this verse is to be referred to God that scrutinizes, that is a God that is always there, that always follows us. And sometimes these constant presence might also be something that causes trouble in a certain way. But then, so I was really, since then, I've been thinking about God's gaze always there. That might be a sort of anxiety on the one hand, but on the contrary, I saw it as a source of consolation. That is God always being there, exactly as a mother's gaze, who's always there and always takes care of her child. So we must think about God's gaze and what is our response to God's gaze. Is it anxiety? Is it, on the contrary, consolation, the presence of God? Thanks, thanks. That was very interesting, and maybe this is also part of my speech at 8. So I would like to anticipate that I had a rather similar experience some years ago. During a meeting in a parish with mothers of children that had to have their first communion, I had really to teach these small children, and I was using a text because I thought that that might be very useful. And one of the mothers said, so this text is rather terrible. It's a bit the same thing this master of novices said. There is this constant presence of a gaze. There is, we can feel persecuted by this gaze. But obviously the standpoint obviously is very important. So now Domenico Burso. And then, so I was wondering with respect to this question of God's gaze, if it is just present in the image of God we have in ourselves, since we are in the likeness of God. So maybe this gaze is within us. And so yesterday we spoke about a mother's case and also the use of a face mask. So my question is, I wonder, maybe this image of God is within us because we are not a flat slate, right? Tabula rasa, flat slate, but we are in the image and likeness of God. Yes, so I would like to make a distinction at a theological level and Genesis 1. We are in the image and likeness of God. And so this is to be distinguished from the image of God we have, that we have in our mind. maybe next year, I want to anticipate that Professor Tenaci here in Gregoriana and myself, we are teaching a same course on the theme of the image of God, that is being created in the image of God, that is, and how we imagine the face of God. Obviously, it is true that we received something of this image in an innate way. And obviously, Baldassar, a Swiss theologian, spoke about a mother's gaze. One of the most terrible things for children leading to atheism is when some grandmothers or aunts say, when there is a child, there is a naughty child, and then stumbles, and the grandmother or the aunt says, it is God punishing you. So it's obvious that if you say like that, a child is going to lose his faith. Well, and so Elena Sidoni, your question. So I was wondering if this luck is a sort of twofold dialogue between a mother and a son, or dialogue between God and ourselves. So I was wondering if in this relation there is a mediation, that is maybe it can be a dialogue with the other, and we can have a dialogue among three people, not two. So these twofold dialogue might lead us to a threefold dialogue. And as we have said, so we have to also look at ourselves, to consider our inner life. So the interiority too is something to be searched, but always through a mediation, as the last two speakers have mentioned and said. I don't know if the two speakers want to comment on this, or maybe you want to give an explanation. Yvonne Duna, please. First of all, thanks a lot, because all these wonderful presentations, obviously you had a really short time to speak about such a difficult subject. So I really appreciate so your commitment and what you have said. When I was young, I had a certain difficulty. So when I started my spiritual exercises, I was very young, and I always asked Jesuits, where can I find the other? So are there spiritual exercises with others, or do I have only to look into myself? Or maybe shall I establish also a relationship to the other, and the other can be a resource. And then also here at the Gregorian have studied this subject, and today by listening to these speeches, on the one hand Augustine, and this wonderful speech about the word that can be educated, but also the word that is internal and external, that is to be found in things. And maybe there is always this open question, things, what are things? What are things for Jesuits? When we listen to Ignatius, his lessons, he doesn't see things, but he sees the Holy Mother. So he sees an image, a vision, not things. So when I gave this title, it was a provocation, because I know that things, the word thing might represent a bit of a stumble, a bit of important elements. So these questions, what are things? Even Augustine and Ignatius, in this relationship, so how can they establish relations to things, and how can we see God in things? Well, I don't know that Father Piccolo's, Father Steve's, you want to give an answer to that. So I try to give an answer maybe by putting Augustine and Ignatius together. First of all, we have to consider terms in the spiritual exercises, because in the fundamentum we speak about things, but then at the end of the exercise, in the Contemplatio Donorum, there is not the word things, but the word gift. So at the end of the exercises, there is a change in the gaze, because things are not seen as things, but as gifts. So there is a new gaze at the end of the exercises. So the conclusion is that things must be seen as gifts. So what are these gifts? And here we have to consider the starting Latin word res. Res is a rather broad term. In Latin, res is to be referred to everything. In fact, in the Contemplatio Amoris, Augustine refers to every single thing. That is, everything is a gift. So there is nothing that is as an end in itself. That is, Augustine says we have to praise God, to thank God for all things. And it's a sort of challenge that is raised by Augustine. Augustine says that all things are gifts, and there are relations, because it is true that the exercises represent a path, but this is not a solipsistic path. And here there is maybe a mistake of the Jesuits, because when Jesuits says so exercises are to be made alone, maybe this is a mistake, because exercises are, according to Ignatius, must be lived in a relational dimension. That is, exercises cannot be conceived alone. Exercises are possible only within a relation, because also if this solipsistic attitude is a sort of betrayal, so when we speak about exercises, we have to think about a relation, and this is a fundamental condition, and the relations are part of these gifts that are the elements on which the exercises are grounded. Thank you. Father Steves. I have to say that there is also a conversion of the gaze. There is things are not put in the world according to a positivistic or materialistic principle. There are different principles for all things. And we can also add, as a specialist and expert of Ignatian spirituality said, that there is a risk in the Ignatian spirituality, that is in the fundamental principle. When we speak about Ignatian indifference, we can find a certain utilitarianism, because we must use things, because things are useful in order to reach our goal, the goal for which we are created. So there is the risk of a certain reductionism. There is a certain idolatry of things, So there is a certain risk to devalue everything, even sacraments, for instance, that sometimes can be seen as something useful to reach God. So there is this risk, and this is implicit in Yvonne's question. Yes, there is this risk. And even religious and community life of the Jesuit is different from other religious lifestyles. So there are many considerations to be done on the point. Now we have now a question by Maddalena Benedict. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for these very interesting presentations. I am studying Protestant theology, so this Ignatian approach is very interesting to me. And now a question, because we spoke about the gaze that can change with the spiritual exercises, and also because with the Father Steve, I always see this painting by Caravaggio. So I want to ask, in the Gospels, there are very often the stories of the disciples that see but do not believe. So there is an attitude that we find many times in the Gospels, and even yesterday we spoke to see the whole in the world. And is this really possible? Is it really possible to see everything in the world? Or maybe this is something that can happen only once, as for the disciples that had only some instant visions of the world of God, and then this vision disappears. So this gaze by Ignatius seems something very complex. So I wonder, how long does this gaze last? Is it very long? So now maybe Father Steves might give an answer to that. On this question of the duration, I think that there is a real difference between the Catholic and Protestant conceptions, and I would like to speak about a Methodist pastor in the United States, and when he spoke about his religious conversion when he was 20, he used to say that he was approaching this altar call, and he cried and he believed, and that changed his life. And I think that among the evangelicals in the United States, there is the same question: if you accept Christ as your personal savior. So this insists on the side of a unique conversion. And this is a bit different from what Reiner, the Catholic thinker, said. I think that the Catholic vision is rather of a continuity through sacraments, that is through communion, through confession, that is at least once a year we must be reconciled to God. And that is, we must say, maybe I just looked at people, at God in a wrong way. So I repent for this wrong case and I want to be reconciled. So those who are Ignatians and those who made the experience of Ignatian exercises maybe might think that with an active imagination. On the contrary, in the autobiography, Ignatius said that he received many things. So we have here a passive imagination. So active imagination in the exercises and passive imagination in the autobiography. So we do not have to exaggerate the exercises. especially if we think about the frescoes in the Jesuit churches in Rome. Sometimes there is often something getting out of the painting, and this corresponds to an experience that we might have in the exercises. That is, it is an exercise loci, that is, it's a sort of painting, and then God, when he makes himself revealed, he bursts out of the painting, he gets out. So there is a sort of dynamic. Thank you. I don't see any other questions, but I might make a remark. When Lisa Lucchese was speaking, I thought about the idea of mediation. That is, we were speaking about things that become a mediation. And here in this context, I'm thinking about a sentence by Saint Ignatius. That is, we can feel as a church, and here we should mention this point. That is, the hierarchical church just establishes things. And I once tried to understand the meaning of that, and I read an article by Father Kolbe, and he just explained that in the context of Catholic mediations. So this is an article. So, and he also mentioned Erasmus, and so there was an ironical approach, because he was inviting people to accept mediations within the Catholic Church. And then now I don't know if Mrs. Lucchese wants to say something on the point. So because maybe this is mediation is rather for Protestantism, but on the contrary, mediation can also have a meaning for Catholics. So I don't know if there is someone who wants to add. I would like to answer in a very indirect way. When I teach someone who wants to start the Ignatian spirituality, how to make these self-searching, and then I always say that there are 4 words. Here I am, thanks, forgive me, or excuse me, please. And then the 5th word, then you must end with a prayer, such as Our Father, Holy Mary, because if you want to examine your conscience, is not something that is personal. So if you do that, because there is a nun in a monastery who is praying for you, and it is thanks to her intercession that you are approaching God. So you must pray to God in order to thank for this nun praying for you. And so prayer is extremely important. Once you have self-searched to your soul and you want to be reinstated within the Catholic Church. I don't know if Mrs. Lucchese wanted to say something. Yes, what I think it very beautiful. So we are speaking about forms of mediation, and this can be very useful, because this might help us to be part and parcel of a whole, because we can feel connected to people, to things. And while I was reading and leading this presentation on Buddhism and the interconnection among real things. So thinking about mediations might help us to understand others, not only the others today, but also other people of previous generations. So there is a connection with tradition. Even tradition is a form of mediation, because tradition enables us to understand how people interpreted religion in the past. So maybe there were other forms of mediation that could establish some affective relations. Gioia Di Domenico, please. So very short question, always concerning mediation. I'm not wondering what mediation is, but what are the connections? As we could compare the awareness of a mediation between objects, people, as Saint Ignatius said, but the arigato of Buddhists. That is, I understand that I reach this point thanks to the people I've met, the things I've seen. That is, without this mediation, I couldn't have reached my present position. Maybe in order to conclude, I would ask Manuele Scarpino, because I'm really thinking about the word. I really don't know if we could make any other connection, because mediation, because we have heard also Ignatians, Padre Piccolo. Maybe we could also say something about Augustine. So I'm so now I'm in Italian. So now maybe Padre Piccolo might say something. Yes, it's something connecting communication. That is this relation between inner world and the external world. The inner world that is not subject to grammar or to language. And Augustine made a reference to communication. And I think that this was extremely important when thinking about the second person of the Holy Trinity. And this is very present in Augustine. That is how flesh is has been embodied and made real. And so this has a sort of theological grounding, but for Augustine, the word can really take on this guarantee. That is the guarantee of the image. And there is a communication among human beings, but the very objective of this external world is to be referred to Christ's mediation, and then to other forms of mediations that are entailed in that. So thanks to you all, thanks for the speakers, and would like to thank also the those who have raised questions. It was very interesting, and now we have an hour's break. So maybe you can have a break for dinner or for lunch in the United States, and then we resume at 8 for the very last stretch, we could say, of this day. So see you.